It's about realizing that you are the prize. You are the prize. You're the prize in your relationship. You're the gift to another person. You're a prize in your workplace. You're lucky to have me. You are the prize.
Welcome to Rise and Thrive Conversations for Greatness. I'm your host, John Merkus, and today we have an incredible guest. She's an optimist, a disruptor, and a social change facilitator. She's passionate about innovative development solutions, change management, and the future of work. She specializes in helping organizations building thriving, people-centric workplaces by integrating neuroscience, psychological safety, and HR human resource practices. We're going to dive into all of that. She works with senior leaders and teams to navigate real-time challenges, transform culture, and drive lasting change. If you're ready to learn about how to lead with resilience, create impact, and embrace the future of work, stay tuned. This will be a conversation for greatness packed with insights that you don't want to miss. Dr. Julia Ashton-Sayers, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, John. It's great to be here. It's fantastic to catch up with you and have a conversation for greatness.
Awesome. And I appreciate you being an avid listener to the show as well. And there's a lot to unpack in that introduction there. But I wanted to ask you a question before we start unpacking all of that.
Mm-hmm.
If I met someone that you knew and I said, "Oh, I'm having Dr. Julia on the show this week," what would you like them to tell me about you?
I think what I'd like them to tell you about me is that I'm dedicated, passionate, engaging, and also striving for excellence. So I want people to find their resting brilliance and to flourish in the workplace.
Nice. I like that terminology, resting brilliance. This is a conversation for greatness. I just want to kick it off the bat here. What's greatness mean to you?
Greatness means a lot of things to me. Initially, it's about courage, being courageous, stepping up, and also leveraging your own resting brilliance or your natural talent and being confident to portray that in different situations. Also, being courageous to speak up when things are not as they should be.
Mm-hmm.
So, having those difficult conversations, I think that's about greatness.
Yep.
And also in the workplace, it's being empowered to have those conversations and be respected and validated.
Yeah, because you don't always feel like you're in an environment to be able to have those kind of conversations. I guess we can dive straight into that psychological safety, because when an organization has that, it does give you license, so to speak, to have those conversations to make things better with the intention of making things better. But I think it's a term that's not widely known. And so can you help our Rise and Thrivers understand what psychological safety means?
In essence, psychological safety means having a workplace or having an environment where you can just ask those dumb questions without being ridiculed.
Yep.
It's an environment where there is trust and empathy, and there is also a belief that everybody has value and everyone can contribute to the conversation, the project, the thinking, and especially being able to float out ideas that may seem a little bit out of the box to start off with, but then allowing that idea to sort of become embedded and to grow that idea on how we could explore that or how we could implement that. So it's also psychological safety is about learning and respect for each other and our individual specializations.
Nice. I can see a workplace like that sounds ideal. Have you come across some of the workplaces that have implemented psychological safety where everyone feels trusted, has a voice, respected, that kind of thing?
Yes, I have. Certainly in the public sector, it was a little bit harder, but in the private sector, if you have the voice at the table, if you are an influential person in the leadership cohort, you can encourage that and build that psychological safety from the top down. In the public sector, so I worked in the public sector for 10 years. Having psychological safety wasn't something that we really fostered. It was more about autocratic leadership
Mm.
and, people being told what to do. They didn't really foster, in the agencies I worked in, they didn't really foster inclusivity. They didn't foster anybody having a difference of opinion if you weren't sort of on the same level as them in the hierarchy. Whereas in private sector and not for profit, and I've worked in not for profit as well, they encourage that innovation through inclusivity and respecting each other's individual contribution and who you are.
Yeah, right. I was going to ask you, if there are leaders out there that maybe want to implement more of that psychological safety in their organisations or teams, what's something that they can do as a starting point to try and make a more empowering workplace?
Okay, there's lots of things you can do, and I really love the question. Admit when you don't know. So it's really hard for some leaders to say, you know what, I really don't know what the answer to that is, because they think that leadership is being someone who has all the answers. Also, about championing respectful challenges. So I see myself as a protagonist, and in the workplace, I like to challenge people's opinions or people's um, behavior, perhaps. I also like to create a culture of learning, and I think that's what leaders can do. And learning happens in different ways through the three E's, experience, exposure, and education. But a lot of people think that learning is all about the 10%, which is education. In a very dynamic organisation, learning is about being in projects. That's where your 70% of your learning happens. Also, encourage complaints or feedback. So, what I look for in feedback is constructive feedback. It's not just, hey, John's a great guy, I really like him, he does a great job. I'm also looking for feedback that tells me about John in specific ways. So, we look at STAR as a way to do that: situation, task, action, result. And then if the result's not ideal, I look at, if I took a different action, what a different result might be. So it's very structured and methodical. So there's some of the key indicators of psychological safety if you're interested in building that in your workforce.
Nice. Thanks for explaining that. I love the three E's. It's not just the education part. Can you go through those three E's again for us?
Exposure is about being involved in corporate conversations, say a virtual lunch and learn or all hands or something that takes people into an environment where they're learning about new things. Experience is around being in a project. 70% of your learning happens when you're in a project. You have an opportunity to absorb the learning that takes place, the interactions. Say if you've got a workforce that is predominantly introvert, but they're expected to communicate with customers, quite often in projects, they're able to see the extroverts and how they communicate confidently. I call that observational learning. That's 70% of your learning. So if you're in a project, you're able to watch the interactions, you're able to watch the de escalations if there is a confrontation. You're able to establish relatedness. You're able to demonstrate influencing skills. And that's where a lot of people who are very introverted are able to get most of their learning, their 70%. And of course, your 10% is your accreditations, your qualifications. So it's a 70-20-10 split, but 70% is in projects.
Yeah, that sounds really good. Learning by experiencing on the job. That sounds
Correct.
like a great way to learn.
It
And
is.
you're right, because some organisations, and we think, oh, well, they'll go on that training course and they'll be right. But there's, as you've said, that's just a small part of your learning on the job.
That's correct. You go on the training course, you get the methodology. You've got to put that into practice. And so when I'm coaching in the workplace, I look at scenario based learning. So I encourage people to bring a scenario to me. We're having a coaching conversation and we look at it without judgment. It's not about I could do better or you should have said this or you should have said that. What was the learning from it? And that in itself is encouraging even more psychological safety, knowing that we don't have to have the perfect answers all the time.
Yeah, and that you, people get to have a voice. And I love that because the context is decisive. So you put them in the context of a real world example.
Yeah.
And often in the show, we say you either win or you learn. It's a resilient mindset. They can do either one
Yep,
in a
absolutely.
safe space.
Exactly. You create the safe space. You say it's okay to make mistakes. I've got your back.
Mm,
It's
mm.
not about it's not about judging. It's about learning.
You mentioned you're a protagonist. I've got you down as a bit of a disruptor as well, but you're also an optimist. So I'm really, sometimes those two traits don't go hand in hand. So I just wanted to ask you about that, how you kind of manage that status quo while maintaining a challenging, I should say, the status quo while maintaining that positive forward thinking mindset.
There's a couple of things I want to add there.
Yep.
And number one, it's situational. So depending on the situation as to whether I'm a protagonist or a disruptor. And quite often, when I'm in a situation and certainly coaching people and they're just going with the flow and staying in their comfort zone, sometimes you've just got to throw in a little soft grenade to get a behavior, to get something to come up that you can work with, whether it's a sort of a judgment that they've held on to or a negative belief about themselves or about others. And so that's more the disruptor. The optimist is about reframing. So I come from a positive psychology background. So Dr. Martin Seligman, he was brilliant. I did his course. I encourage everybody to check him out as well. Martin Seligman, he talks about positive psychology. So some other time I'd like to come back and talk to you more about that. But it's about reframing the situation, looking at it from a very different perspective. If you're looking at a very negative situation or a conversation and you come away and you have all the emotional indicators that, it hasn't been a positive experience, taking that less than positive experience and turning it around and reframing it and saying, what have I learnt from this, either about myself or about that person? And I think I'm going to quote something really badly, but I remember a quote where someone says, between an action and a response, there's a moment. And I use that moment to reframe. And quite often, if I'm in an argumentative situation, especially at work, I will pull back and reflect in that moment and think about my response. And my response is usually a very existential humanistic response. So that's Carl Rogers. He actually created that psychotherapy. And my response usually goes, oh, It's never really a word response. It's more like I'm taking this in and
Mm.
I'm reframing it. I may choose to respond in the moment if I can do that intelligently without any emotion, or I may usually take it offline. And then once I've debriefed myself and once I've thought about it, I'll come back to the situation and I'll have a conversation with that person. So does that sort of answer the sort of
Yeah.
dynamic?
That sounds like a really great way also to handle conflict or when something's escalated. I've heard about the 7-second rule where you can give yourself that time before you respond, but also
Mm,
we can't necessarily do that in a work meeting and go, hang on, just give me 7 seconds before before I respond. So I really love the way how you've said there are things that you can do that are non-verbal to either give you that time to, as you say, reframe or have a think about how you might want to respond, and
mm.
then assess the situation to even go and even put that off so you can digest that a bit further to respond afterwards. That sounds like a really mature way to go. And I know we're emotional beings. And so,
Yeah.
because I noticed you said without emotion,
Mm,
and I always struggle sometimes between controlling my emotions and then saying to myself, I'm an emotional kind of guy, so it's okay to be emotional. What's your take on that? Because I know in that case that you just described, and I guess it's situational, is what you probably say, but I guess in that case you just described, if you're feeling that emotion of anger or whatnot, you definitely want to control that because nothing much good really came out of people being angry in a work situation. Yeah, what's your take on that?
breathe.
Yeah. That's a good idea.
Just focus on your breathing.
Yep.
If you can feel the emotion rising, and we are emotional beings.
Mm.
We're not robot, we're not AI yet. Um, we are emotional beings. So it's quite normal if somebody disrespects you in a meeting, or if somebody is overtly angry in a meeting and you want to respond to it. And the worst thing you can do in an argument is add that same fuel to the fire. What I like to do is deliberate breathing. And if you can do it with sort of a smile on your face, yeah, it's about having agency over your emotions. It's about
Mm.
being the commander of your
Mm.
own emotional world. And I think I like to do that, but I'll also say I don't always do that.
Yeah, well, yeah, we're human, yeah, and that's the beauty of being human. You make mistakes, so you can learn and grow. The commander or the captain of your own ship. That's I like the way that you've put that, and using the body to enhance the mind and your emotions.
Mm,
Absolutely critical, isn't it? I think it's one of the most underrated things that we can do as human beings, using our body to enhance the mind, whether you get up off your desk and go for that walk, whether you breathe, as you say.
mm,
There's lots of other things that you can do as well. I know some people, they've got a juggling ball and they start to juggle because they know they're going to use different parts of their mind and it's going to change their emotional state. So there's lots and lots of things that you can do. So thanks for sharing all that. Now, you said we'll come back to positive psychology, but I did want to touch on it a little bit more if we can, because it fascinates me. And I actually wrote a note saying it sounds like something we all should do. And then you've also said that as well. So you've got your certification from the University of Pennsylvania. I'm wondering what was the catalyst to you going, yeah, this is something that I really want to do. And can you explain more about what you got out of it?
oh dear, the catalyst. That's such a great question. Okay, the catalyst was I was struggling in my PhD, and I was going down a very dark tunnel. I was working with a supervisor, and we did not get each other. We came from different places, we came from different perspectives. We were just constantly clashing. And that's when I was still in Canberra, and I was working with her. Brilliant, brilliant um, professor, but it was just so hard. And after every meeting I'd have with her, I'd be driving home crying. It's like, I'm never going to be good enough. I'm not smart enough, and this is not going to happen. Anyway, so it just so happened that when I moved to my new location, that particular university couldn't do external studies. And so I went to another university that did external, and I connected with an absolutely amazing, brilliant professor. And we've actually become friends because she's such an incredible humanistic teacher, person. She's so inspirational. But during the period between sort of leaving off with one supervisor and going to the other, I did some self reflection on where I was and how I allowed myself to sort of go down this path of negativity and, self disbelief. I'm not good enough. This is not going to happen. I'm not going to get there. This is such a big goal. Set myself up for failure. And so I saw this course with Martin Seligman, and I'd read his books before, connecting with him and what an authentic leader he was. So he comes to the lecture as, you know what, I used to be on medication all the time. I was negative. It wasn't doing me any good. Now, this is a leading psychotherapist, right? So he's really putting himself out there in a very vulnerable way. And he said, I was out gardening one day and one of my children said to me, why are you so negative all the time, Dad? Like it's a beautiful day. And he took a step back and he thought, you know what? Our thoughts are so important. Our thoughts guide our behaviour. And so he just started up with PERMA, which is about just reframing, thinking about things in a very different frame.
Mm.
And so when I started on that course, I was because I'm a little bit OCD. It's like being a bit pregnant, I know, but I'm a little bit OCD, and I just dove into it and just ate it all up. It was just great. And I thought, at university, I studied all the different methodologies, psychotherapy, psychodynamic, cognitive behavioral, Freud, Jung, all of those great psychotherapists. But it was just that positive psychology is about making your way in this crazy, chaotic world, knowing that you are only responsible for what you can control. So you look at things, is this in my control or is this out of my control?
Yeah, controlling the controllables. You hear that in sporting teams, you hear that a fair bit because if you're trying to control things that you can't control, it's the pathway to insanity, I believe, anyway.
I think it's very similar. I think it aligns perfectly with the other one that says if you keep doing the same thing expecting a different result, that's also a pathway to insanity. But, we're living in a world that's, there's a lot of political things that are happening around us. Is that in our control? No, it's not. What is in our control is how we monitor that, how we respond to that, how we absorb that information.
Yep.
So, reading lots of positive books and, I'm still writing papers as well. Those sorts of things stretch and learn and grow and try and stay away from the negative messaging. So that's what I love about Rise and Thrive so much.
Thanks, Dr. Julia. The things you're saying resonate perfectly with an optimist, I should say, or an optimistic point of view, and a lot of resilience principles that we've had on the show before. We had a whole season, Resilience Revolution. You've studied so much in the psychological area, and I guess as a I don't want to. I was going to call you a human resources person, but you're more than that. So what could I call you to give you the right title? Because you've got the psychology, you've studied heaps, you've got so much experience, you've written white papers on this kind of thing. I just don't think human resources person cuts it.
I think goddess works.
Yeah. HIR goddess, or person you want in your, is a long title for you. Person you want in your organisation to make sure everyone is getting what they need, feels valued and respected.
And thriving.
Yeah.
That's in support of people and their brilliance, but also making sure they're thriving, they're turning up, wanting to be there and delivering great for the organisation. The organisation has to look after that too. I see an organisation as a living organism, and that organism is comprised of people. And if those people are thriving, if those people are turning up and excited to be there and delivering great outputs, then your organism is going to be healthy.
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned you're working on your PhD and you are a doctor. So can you talk more about your PhD?
I have graduated a few years ago, so I'm qualified. My area of specialisation was leadership and change management, also psychological capital during change management.
Right.
So leadership approaches, I looked at that, what was a good leader, what was not a good leader. But the study itself was on two organisations. One was going through radical change and one was going through incremental change. And just in short, I can tell you the agency going through incremental change also had visionary leaders, right? So they were able to set the vision, communicate effectively about what the change was about. Whereas the agency that was going through radical change, it was more like, you're going through this change, we're telling you need to do it, but we're not telling you why. And as Simon Sinek says, we've got to start with the why, right?
Definitely. You see that so often. I've seen it as well. People often think because kids always want to know why, and you think, well, that's important for kids, but they don't realise as adults we really need the why as well to connect the dots and really get on board, especially if you've got a major vision or a mission that some of these organisations that you're talking about would be on.
And the why has to be meaningful. The why has to be very meaningful. And I can just hear my mother's voice as a very small child. She would condemn me for being a why child. And I said, but I need to know why.
Yeah.
And I think having a curious mind is probably a better asset than being highly intelligent. It's one thing to be highly intelligent, that's great. In your specialisation, fantastic. But I think having a curious mind and being a lifelong learner
Mm.
is something that is such a great asset. If you have that and you're driven by that, the world is your own.
It
You can create whatever you want, manifest whatever you want.
I couldn't agree with you more. And it's is a great way. You were talking about reframing earlier. So when you reframe to "I'm curious about that," rather
Hmm.
than "this happened to me" or other situations that you might find yourself, that's where there's gold in there, isn't there?
There is. That is really sort of fossicking for that gold is part of the, the passion that I have. I
Mm,
see
mm,
gold in everyone. I see gold in everyone who turns up to have a conversation with me. They're all very unique, they're very individual, but there is gold there. And what I like to try and do is fossick for that gold
yeah.
and bring it to the surface where they feel confident to showcase the gold.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I like what you did earlier with mentioning a bit of thriving there. It fits perfectly in having those great conversations for greatness. Thanks very much. Loving that. And
You're
we're on
welcome.
brand here, which is good. With the philosophy stuff, when someone says they've read a bit of Jung and done some other things in philosophy, I've got to go a bit deeper into that because I haven't studied philosophy, but I do love it. And every time I'm exposed to it, I learn something. I think it's just wonderful. And it always amazes me. In some ways, it shouldn't, in a way that, a lot of these writings written hundreds of years ago by human beings are so relevant today in our fast paced technological world. So, is there something from one of the greats that you've read that's really resonated with you that you think could help listeners? Because sometimes what I've found is something that might be almost second nature to you because you've been in this world is an
Hmm.
absolute mind blower to someone that has not necessarily gone down the same path or is seeking that information early in their journey. So is there anything from those greats that have really made a difference to you that you can share with our listeners?
That is such a fabulous question, and my brain is just lit up, right? With so many different responses. But I guess the most influential, other than Martin Seligman, is Carl Gustav Jung.